The office was cloaked in its usual end-of-day monotony. Sarah Carter sat at her desk, absently scrolling through spreadsheets while the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter of her co-workers filled the air. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, already planning what to make for dinner when she got home to Daniel. Then her phone rang. The unfamiliar number made her hesitate, but something compelled her to answer. She placed her coffee down, her pulse quickening as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello, Mrs. Carter?" The voice on the other end was calm, but heavy, like the bearer of unwelcome news. "Yes, this is she," Sarah replied, her tone cautious. "This is Officer Reynolds with the County Police Department. I'm calling about an incident at your home. I need you to come back right away." Sarah sat upright, her hand tightening around the phone. "My home? What kind of incident? What happened?" There was a pause, long enough for her mind to begin racing. "There's no easy way to say this, Mrs. Carter," the officer said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. "Your husband, Daniel, he's been shot. He didn't make it." Sarah froze. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. What do you mean? Shot? Are you sure it's him?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We've confirmed his identity. It's Daniel." The room around her blurred as panic rose in her chest. "Who did this? How? Was it a break-in?" "We're investigating all possibilities, but I need you to come home so we can talk further," Reynolds said, his tone measured but firm. She barely heard him. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto her desk, drawing the attention of her nearby co-workers. "Sarah, are you okay?" one of them asked, but she didn't respond. Her ears rang with the officer's words, and her body moved on autopilot as she grabbed her bag and stumbled toward the elevator. The drive home felt endless. Every possible scenario played through her mind, each darker than the last. Did Daniel have enemies? Had he mentioned feeling unsafe? She couldn't recall. By the time she reached her street, the flashing red and blue lights made her stomach churn. Police cars were parked haphazardly along the driveway, their presence overwhelming in the stillness of her suburban neighborhood. She barely managed to park before throwing the door open and running toward the house. "Mrs. Carter?" a voice called. She turned to see Officer Reynolds stepping forward, his face as grave as his voice had been. "Where is he?" Sarah demanded, her voice breaking. "I need to see him. I need to." "Ma'am, you can't go inside. It's an active crime scene," Reynolds said firmly, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Her chest heaved, her vision swimming. "But, Daniel, this can't. Why?" "We'll do everything we can to find out what happened," Reynolds said softly. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I promise we'll get to the bottom of this." But his words barely registered. All Sarah could do was stare at the house, at the silhouette of the crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, and wonder how the world had unraveled so quickly. Sarah sat on the curb outside her house, the cold air pressing against her skin like a vice. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, the screen still illuminated with the last call she'd made to Daniel. Voicemail. She had left him a rushed, "Call me back, please," hours ago. Now, those words felt like a cruel echo of her helplessness. Officer Reynolds crouched beside her, his tone calm but insistent. "Mrs. Carter, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions." She nodded numbly, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. "Do you know if Daniel had any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt him?" His question made her pause. "Daniel? Enemies?" It seemed absurd. Daniel was charming, kind, and well-liked, or at least that's how she had always seen him. "But recently, there's been tension at his work," she said hesitantly. "He mentioned disagreements with some of his colleagues. And a neighbor, Mr. Peterson, argued with him a few weeks ago about the property line. But nothing serious enough to," her voice faltered. Reynolds scribbled in his notebook. "Did Daniel ever talk about feeling threatened? Any strange calls, unusual behavior?" She shook her head, the edges of her memory betraying her. "No, not really. He's been stressed lately, but I thought it was just work." Reynolds pressed on. "And you? Did you notice anything unusual at home? Break-ins, unfamiliar vehicles, anything out of place?" "No," she said firmly, though her mind suddenly latched onto a forgotten moment. Last week, Daniel had come home late, a look on his face she couldn't place. When she asked him what was wrong, He had brushed it off with a weak smile and a kiss on her forehead. She had let it go, assuming it was work again. "Do you think this was a random attack?" she asked, her voice trembling. Reynolds' expression darkened, his silence louder than any answer he could have given. As they spoke, another officer emerged from the house. He approached Reynolds and whispered something in his ear. Reynolds nodded, his face grim as he turned back to Sarah. "We're working on several leads, Mrs. Carter," he said, avoiding her eyes. "But there's something else. Can you account for your whereabouts today, between 6 and 8 p.m.? Her stomach dropped. "What? You don't think?" "No. I was at work. I was on a call until 6:15, then finishing reports. You can ask my boss." Reynolds raised his hands placatingly. "It's standard procedure. We're not pointing fingers, but we need a clear timeline for everyone connected to Daniel." Sarah nodded reluctantly, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tension creeping into her chest. The lights from the house seemed to flicker, casting long shadows on the neatly trimmed lawn. Somewhere deep within her, a tiny voice whispered a question she couldn't ignore. Who did this? And why did she feel like she already knew the answer? The hours after the officer's questions dragged on like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah sat on the couch in a neighbor's house across the street, cradling a cup of untouched tea. Mrs. Blanchard, a sweet elderly woman who always insisted on sharing her garden tomatoes, hovered nearby, offering quiet reassurances. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her mind replayed every interaction with Daniel over the past month, searching for clues, anything that could explain how they had ended up here. Daniel had been distant lately. He'd stopped sharing the little details of his day, brushing off her questions with vague answers. She had chalked it up to stress, the kind that came from long hours in office politics. But now, with Officer Reynolds' words echoing in her ears, the cracks in her marriage seemed wider, deeper. Her phone buzzed in her lap, jolting her from her spiraling thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't trust everything they tell you." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the words. She read them again and again, her heart pounding faster each time. "What's wrong, dear?" Mrs. Blanchard asked, her brow furrowed. "Nothing," Sarah replied, quickly locking the phone and forcing a weak smile. But her mind was racing. Who would send something like that? Was it a cruel prank? Someone who knew more than they were letting on? She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her coat, she mumbled a quick thank you to Mrs. Blanchard and stepped out into the chilly night. The house loomed across the street, still wrapped in police tape. Officers moved in and out, their flashlights slicing through the dark like searchlights. She spotted Officer Reynolds standing near his car, speaking to another officer. She marched toward him, her legs heavy with equal parts fear and determination. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to know, do you think this was random? Or was Daniel targeted?" Reynolds hesitated, his expression unreadable. "It's too early to say for sure, Mrs. Carter, but there are details that suggest this wasn't a random break-in." "Details?" Sarah pressed, her chest tightening. "What kind of details?" He glanced at his colleague before answering. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this, they either had a key or Daniel let them in willingly. Sarah staggered back a step, her mind reeling. But why would Daniel let someone in if he felt unsafe? Did he know who did this? "That's what we're trying to determine," Reynolds said carefully. "We'll need to review his phone records, emails, anything that could give us a lead." As he spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message. "They're looking in the wrong place." Her fingers trembled as she read the words. It felt like the sender was watching her, like they were just beyond the circle of police lights. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Reynolds asked, noticing the change in her expression. "Why, yes," she stammered, quickly shoving the phone into her pocket. I need a moment." She backed away, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The cracks in her reality were widening, and she could feel herself slipping through. Who was sending these messages? And what did they know about Daniel's death? As she stood in the cold, staring at the house that had once been her sanctuary, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Back at Mrs. Blanchard's house, Sarah paced the small living room, her hands gripping her phone like a lifeline. The messages from the unknown number burned in her mind, each word carrying an unsettling weight. You shouldn't trust everything they tell you. They're looking in the wrong place. Her first instinct was to take them to the police, but something stopped her. Whoever was sending these messages seemed to know more than anyone else, and Sarah feared that involving the authorities might scare them away. For now, she needed to figure out the truth herself. She opened Daniel's contact on her phone and scrolled to their recent messages. Nothing seemed unusual. Reminders about errands, a quick love you from the night before. But a sense of unease lingered as she reread his last text. Working late. Don't wait up. He'd sent it at 7:23 p.m., just hours before his death. But if he'd been working late, why had he been at home? Desperate for answers, she decided to search deeper. Logging into Daniel's email account wasn't hard. She'd known his password for years. But as she skimmed through his inbox, her heart sank. Among the usual work correspondence and subscription emails, there were dozens of messages from a name she didn't recognize. Emma W. The emails spanned months, their subject lines vague but suggestive. Her stomach churned as she opened one from last week. Subject: Can't keep doing this. Message: We need to talk, Daniel. You've been making promises for months, and I can't keep living in the shadows. If you can't follow through, then I will. Sarah's hands shook as she read and reread the words. Was this woman an affair? A colleague? Or something worse? Her mind raced back to Daniel's behavior in recent weeks. The late nights, the vague excuses, the tension she'd chalked up to work stress. Could Emma have been involved in his death? Before she could dwell on it further, her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. Follow the money. She stared at the words, her pulse quickening. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't just taunting her. They were pointing her towards something. She returned to Daniel's emails, scrolling until she found a thread with the subject: Account transfers. Her breath caught as she clicked on it. Subject: Account transfers. From Daniel Carter to Emma W. Message: The last payment will be in your account by Friday. After that, we're done. Attached was a receipt for a wire transfer of $15,000. The recipient's account was blurred, but Emma's name was clear. Sarah's mind reeled. Why was Daniel sending money to this woman? What had he gotten himself into? The sound of footsteps snapped her out of her thoughts. Mrs. Blanchard peeked into the room, her face etched with concern. Dear, are you sure you're all right? You've been pacing for an hour. Sarah forced a weak smile. I'm fine, thank you. I just need some air. She stepped outside, the night's chill biting at her skin. As she stared across the street at her darkened house, a question churned in her mind. Who was Emma W? And how far would she go to get what she wanted? The next morning, Sarah couldn't sit still. The unknown messages, the emails, the shadow of Emma W, they clung to her like a weight she couldn't shake. She needed answers. Sitting in the driver's seat of her car, parked just down the block from her house, she thumbed through Daniel's phone records. The police had taken his phone, but she still had access to their shared account online. It didn't take long to find her first lead. Among the recent calls, a number repeated several times. Once in the morning, again that afternoon, and one last call at 6:54 p.m., just half an hour before Daniel's death. The number didn't have a name attached, but Sarah had a strong feeling it belonged to Emma. Her fingers hovered over the call button. The idea of speaking to this woman, of confronting whatever truth lay on the other end, made her stomach twist. But she had no choice. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. Hello? A woman's voice answered, cautious but steady. Emma, Sarah asked, her voice tight. There was a pause. Who's asking? This is Sarah Carter, Daniel's wife. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Emma exhaled sharply, like the wind had been knocked out of her. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I didn't know if I should call you, but I heard what happened. I can't believe he's gone. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. What exactly was your relationship with my husband, Emma? Why was he sending you money? There was a long silence before Emma spoke again, her voice low and laced with hesitation. I didn't want to get involved with this. But Daniel, he told me he had no choice. No choice about what? Emma hesitated. You should ask him. Sarah's breath hitched. He's dead, Emma. I can't ask him anything. So I'm asking you, why was he giving you thousands of dollars? What were you doing for him? Emma's tone hardened. I don't know how much you already know, but Daniel wasn't who you thought he was. He had enemies. He said they were dangerous, and he needed me to keep certain things quiet. Sarah's head spun. What things? I don't know all the details, Emma replied. I just helped him with the money. He asked me to move it around so it couldn't be traced. That's all. I swear. The line crackled with silence as Sarah processed Emma's words. Daniel had always been responsible with money. Cautious, even. This didn't make sense. And you didn't think to question any of this? Sarah snapped, anger bubbling to the surface. Part 8. The threat. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she drove away from Ridgeway, her thoughts spinning like a storm. The woman's words echoed in her mind. When you're in for life. She pulled into a nearby parking lot and killed the engine, needing a moment to breathe. Her phone sat in the cup holder, the unknown sender's message glaring up at her. You shouldn't have gone there. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Enough was enough. She was going to confront whoever had been messaging her. Sarah typed back. Who are you? What do you know about Daniel? The reply came almost instantly. I'm trying to help you. But if you keep digging, you'll end up like him. Her chest tightened. You knew Daniel? Tell me the truth. Did Ridgeway kill him? There was no reply for several minutes, just enough time for her anxiety to creep in. Finally, her phone buzzed again. Daniel had enemies, but Ridgeway isn't your biggest problem. Sarah frowned. What could be bigger than Ridgeway? She typed furiously. What are you talking about? Who else would want him dead? This time, the reply chilled her to the bone. Ask yourself who benefits from his death. Her mind reeled. She thought of Emma W., of the mysterious payments, of Daniel's attempt to cut ties with Ridgeway. And then another thought, a dark, intrusive whisper, slithered into her mind. What if it's you? Her phone buzzed again before she could chase the thought further. You're not as innocent as you think. A wave of nausea hit her as a memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. A few months ago, during a heated argument, Daniel had accused her of being distant. You don't even look at me the same way anymore, he had said, his voice heavy with hurt. She'd fired back, accusing him of burying himself in work and shutting her out. That night, she'd thought to herself, fleeting but venomous, how much simpler life would be without him. It had been a moment of anger, nothing more. She would never have acted on it. Would she? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. You made a move, Sarah. You just didn't realize who was watching. Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. Whoever this was, they knew too much about Ridgeway, about Daniel, about her. Suddenly, she became acutely aware of her surroundings. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for a lone black sedan idling a few spaces away. Its windows were tinted, concealing whoever might be inside. Panic surged through her. She started the car, her eyes darting between the sedan and the road ahead. As she pulled out of the lot, the sedan followed. Her pulse raced. She turned left at the next intersection, then right, weaving through side streets in a desperate attempt to lose her pursuer. But the sedan stayed on her tail, its presence as unyielding as the fear clawing at her chest. Finally, she veered onto a highway ramp, the car's tires screeching as she accelerated. The sedan didn't follow, its brake lights glowing faintly in her rearview mirror before disappearing into the distance. Sarah exhaled shakily, her grip on the wheel iron tight. Whoever was behind this, Ridgeway, Emma, the faceless texter, they weren't going to let her walk away unscathed. And now, she wasn't sure if she could trust anyone. Dangerous. Something far beyond her understanding. And yet, in his own flawed way, he'd tried to shield her from it. She clicked back to the folder and opened another file labeled Transactions. A list of payments, names, and account numbers filled the screen. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved over months. At the bottom of the file was one final note from Daniel. I know you'll hate me for keeping this from you, but if there's one thing you believe, let it be this. I loved you. I always will. The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her back to the present. It was another text from the unknown number. "You're close. Be careful." A chill ran down her spine. Whoever was sending these messages wasn't just watching. They were involved. As she stared at the screen, a new resolve hardened within her. She didn't know what Ridgeway was or who it pointed to, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop until she found out. Sarah parked her car a block away, staring at the unassuming building Ridgeway called home. It was a bland, gray structure with no signage, just a black metal door with a small keypad. The industrial park around it was eerily quiet, the kind of place that would go unnoticed unless you were looking for it. Her palms were damp as she stepped up to the door and pressed the buzzer. "Yes," a man's voice crackled through the intercom, cold and detached. "I'm here to discuss an account," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. The pause that followed was long enough to make her second-guess her decision. But then there was a metallic click, and the door unlocked. The interior was even more sterile than she'd imagined. Gray walls, dim fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. A receptionist sat behind a sleek, black desk, his face impassive. "Who referred you to us?" he asked, not looking up from his screen. "Daniel Carter," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. His eyes flicked up briefly, a shadow of recognition crossing his face before he gestured toward a hallway. "Follow me." Sarah's stomach churned as she was led deeper into the building. The corridor was lined with unmarked doors, their frosted glass windows hiding whatever was inside. As they passed one, she caught a glimpse of movement, a man in a dark suit leaning over a table covered in papers. The door shut quickly before she could see more. The receptionist stopped outside a small office and opened the door for her. "Wait here." The room was as unremarkable as the rest of the building. A simple desk, 2 chairs, and a computer. But on the desk was a folder left slightly ajar, revealing a sheet of paper with names and numbers scrawled in neat columns. Sarah's breath hitched as she spotted the name Daniel Carter among them. Before she could examine it further, the door opened, and a woman entered. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that made Sarah instinctively straighten in her chair. "You're Daniel's wife," the woman said, her tone more a statement than a question. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice taut. "I need to know what's going on. What was Daniel involved in?" The woman sat across from her, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "Mrs. Carter, Ridgeway is a solutions provider. We move assets, erase problems, and ensure that the world's wealthiest and most influential people can operate without obstacles. Your husband used our services extensively." "For what?" Sarah pressed, her voice rising. The woman's gaze was icy. "For the same reason anyone does, to solve problems he couldn't handle himself. Unfortunately, Daniel made the mistake of thinking he could walk away." Sarah's stomach turned. "Walk away from what?" The woman leaned forward slightly. "From us. Ridgeway isn't just a company. We're a network, Mrs. Carter. We don't just move money, we manage situations. When a client tries to cut ties without fulfilling their obligations, things escalate." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You killed him." The woman didn't blink. "We don't get our hands dirty, Mrs. Carter. We don't have to. But let's just say Daniel's death served as a warning to others who might consider breaking their contracts." Sarah felt the weight of the folder on the desk, the unseen presence of the closed doors in the hallway. "What was he paying you for? What did he do that was so dangerous?" The woman studied her for a long moment. "That's not a question you want answered. My advice? Drop this. Forget you were ever here. The more you dig, the more likely you are to end up like him." She stood, her movements sharp and final, and gestured to the door. "This conversation is over. Don't come back." As Sarah stumbled out of the building, her mind racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ridgeway wasn't just watching her. They were waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her phone buzzed as she reached her car. Another text from the unknown number. "You should have stayed away." Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't just a bystander. They were part of this, and they weren't done with her yet. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she drove away from Ridgeway, her thoughts spinning like a storm. The woman's words echoed in her mind. "When you're in for life." She pulled into a nearby parking lot and killed the engine, needing a moment to breathe. Her phone sat in the cup holder, the unknown sender's message glaring up at her. You shouldn't have gone there. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Enough was enough. She was going to confront whoever had been messaging her. Sarah typed back, "Who are you? What do you know about Daniel?" The reply came almost instantly. "I'm trying to help you. But if you keep digging, you'll end up like him." Her chest tightened. "You knew Daniel? Tell me the truth. Did Ridgway kill him?" There was no reply for several minutes, just enough time for her anxiety to creep in. Finally, her phone buzzed again. Daniel had enemies, but Ridgway isn't your biggest problem. Sarah frowned. What could be bigger than Ridgway? She typed furiously. "What are you talking about? Who else would want him dead?" This time, the reply chilled her to the bone. "Ask yourself who benefits from his death." Her mind reeled. She thought of Emma W., of the mysterious payments, of Daniel's attempt to cut ties with Ridgway. And then another thought, a dark, intrusive whisper, slithered into her mind. "What if it's you?" Her phone buzzed again before she could chase the thought further. "You're not as innocent as you think." A wave of nausea hit her as a memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. A few months ago, during a heated argument, Daniel had accused her of being distant. "You don't even look at me the same way anymore," he had said, his voice heavy with hurt. She'd fired back, accusing him of burying himself in work and shutting her out. That night, she'd thought to herself, fleeting but venomous, how much simpler life would be without him. It had been a moment of anger, nothing more. She would never have acted on it. Would she? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. "You made a move, Sarah. You just didn't realize who was watching." Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. Whoever this was, they knew too much about Ridgway, about Daniel, about her. Suddenly, she became acutely aware of her surroundings. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for a lone black sedan idling a few spaces away. Its windows were tinted, concealing whoever might be inside. Panic surged through her. She started the car, her eyes darting between the sedan and the road ahead. As she pulled out of the lot, the sedan followed. Her pulse raced. She turned left at the next intersection, then right, weaving through side streets in a desperate attempt to lose her pursuer. But the sedan stayed on her tail, its presence as unyielding as the fear clawing at her chest. Finally, she veered onto a highway ramp, the car's tires screeching as she accelerated. The sedan didn't follow, its brake lights glowing faintly in her rearview mirror before disappearing into the distance. Sarah exhaled shakily, her grip on the wheel iron tight. Whoever was behind this, Ridgway, Emma, the faceless texter, they weren't going to let her walk away unscathed. And now, she wasn't sure if she could trust anyone. Sarah didn't go home that night. Instead, she checked into a small roadside motel, the kind of place that didn't ask questions as long as you paid in cash. The faded wallpaper and dim lighting did little to calm her nerves, but it was better than returning to her empty, chaotic house. She sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day replaying in her mind. Ridgway's threats, the cryptic texts, the shadow of Daniel's secret life. All of it pointed to something larger, something dangerous. Her phone buzzed again. For a moment, she hesitated, debating whether to ignore it. But curiosity won, as it always did. You can't run forever. Her blood turned to ice. Whoever was texting her knew where she was, or at least wanted her to believe they did. A knock at the door made her jump. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the peephole. Relief and fear collided when she saw the familiar face of Officer Reynolds standing on the other side. "Mrs. Carter?" his muffled voice called. "I need to speak with you." Sarah hesitated. How had he found her? Had the police tracked her down? Or was this something else entirely? After a moment's deliberation, she opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. "What are you doing here?" Reynolds looked exhausted, his uniform slightly rumpled. "We need to talk. There's been a development in your husband's case." She closed the door just long enough to unhook the chain, then let him in. Reynolds stepped inside, his expression grim. "What kind of development?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms. Reynolds hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. We've been going through Daniel's financial records. There were significant transfers to a woman named Emma W. Do you know anything about that? The question was a test. Sarah could feel it. I found out about her after his death, she admitted. She told me she was helping him move money. He said he was in trouble, that he was protecting me. Reynolds studied her face, his eyes narrowing. Protecting you from what? Ridgeway, she said. It's a company, an offshore account service. Daniel was trying to cut ties with them, but they wouldn't let him go. They said, her voice faltered. They said he made enemies. Reynolds frowned. Mrs. Carter, do you have any idea how dangerous this is? Ridgeway isn't just a company. It's a syndicate. People who cross them don't just get warnings. Her stomach sank. You think they killed him? We're exploring every angle, he replied. But there's something else. We found a record of a phone call placed to a less than reputable website, the kind that connects people with hired killers. Sarah's blood ran cold. Reynolds took a step closer, his tone softening. Do you know anything about that, Mrs. Carter? She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. No, of course not. His gaze lingered on her, as if searching for cracks in her denial. Finally, he nodded. All right, but if there's anything you're not telling me, now's the time to come clean. I told you everything I know, she insisted, though the weight of her guilt felt like a physical presence. Reynolds sighed, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. If you think of anything else, call me. But be careful. If Ridgeway is involved, you're already in over your head. He left without another word, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She sat back on the bed, her hands trembling. Reynolds didn't know the half of it. The memory resurfaced like a slap in the face. The night she'd searched online in a fit of rage, the website she'd stumbled across, the inquiry she'd filled out but never submitted. Or so she thought. Had someone else submitted it? Was that why Daniel was dead? Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. You've always known the truth. Stop pretending. Sarah stared at the message, her heart pounding. The cracks in her story were growing wider, and she couldn't stop wondering if the person sending these messages was right. Sarah spent the night sleepless, her mind spinning in an endless loop of doubt, guilt, and terror. The idea that she might have played a role in Daniel's death was too horrifying to confront, yet it loomed over her, casting long shadows on every memory of their life together. By morning, she knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She retrieved her laptop and reopened the dark chapter she'd tried so hard to forget. The website was still there, its cold, clinical design exactly as she remembered. The tagline at the top read, "For discreet solutions, look no further." Her fingers trembled as she navigated to the login page, entering the email and password she'd used months ago. She wasn't sure why she remembered them so clearly. Maybe some part of her had always feared this moment. When the dashboard loaded, her heart stopped. There was under the section labeled Requests. Status, completed. Her throat tightened as she clicked on the request. The details stared back at her, undeniable and damning. The name of the target, Daniel Carter. The justification she had drunkenly typed that night. He doesn't deserve to live after what he's done to me. A wave of nausea hit her. She had written those words in a moment of fury, venting her frustrations about their crumbling marriage. She hadn't meant it. She hadn't submitted it. Or at least she didn't think she had. Her breath quickened as she scrolled further. The transaction had been paid in full. But by whom? She hadn't followed through. She was certain of it. The ringing of her phone startled her, and she nearly dropped it. The caller ID was unknown. With shaking hands, she answered. "Hello." "You've finally pieced it together," said the voice on the other end. It was distorted, unrecognizable. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "A friend," the voice replied. "One who knows how far you were willing to go." "I didn't do this," Sarah insisted. "I never submitted that request. I never wanted him dead. But someone else did." The voice countered, calm and unnerving. "Someone who saw an opportunity and took it." Her mind raced. Ridgeway facilitated it, yes. But the true culprit? Look closer to home. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her pulse pounding. Her hands instinctively went back to the laptop, scrolling through the details of the payment. Then she saw it. A name buried in the metadata of the transaction. Emma W. It hit her like a freight train. Emma. The money transfers. The cryptic threats. Daniel's attempts to cut ties. Emma had taken Sarah's impulsive actions and turned them into something real, something irreversible. She barely had time to process the revelation when another thought struck her like a slap. Emma had made herself too visible. If Sarah had found her, so had Ridgway. Her phone buzzed once more. A message. She won't talk. Ridgway made sure of that. Sarah's stomach dropped. She typed back, her desperation spilling into her words. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? The reply was immediate. To make sure you don't forget. Your choices started this. Now you'll live with the consequences. Her hands shook as she stared at the words. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of her actions and inactions crushing her from all sides. The door to her motel room rattled suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. She froze, staring at the handle as it turned slowly. Sarah, came Officer Reynolds' voice from the other side. It's me. Open the door. She hesitated. Could she trust him? Or was he another thread in the tangled web surrounding her? Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door, bracing herself for whatever came next. Reynolds stepped inside, his face grave. We need to talk. His words were heavy with implication. Sarah knew the conversation they were about to have would change everything. About what? She asked, though she already knew the answer. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. About what you've done.